Salutations, respected viewers. This is George from Ireland, and this video is an introduction to the Irish oppression myth. So what is it? Well, it's a viewpoint that's been around for decades, perhaps longer, that Ireland is MOPE, the most oppressed people ever. This was an expression that was coined in the 90s to lampoon Gerard Adams' claim that we were terribly mistreated by the English for a long time. Now, obviously, England and Ireland have had some political connection since 1171, and in that time, people in Ireland have sometimes been badly treated. Sometimes there's a few people, sometimes it was a great number of people. But that's not always much to do with our political connection with our neighbour, because of course people in Ireland were sometimes treated badly prior to 1171, and in that majority of Ireland, which is separate from the United Kingdom, sometimes people were mistreated since 1921. Often it was just the era, not the fact that we were related to England in a political sense. So this is an extraordinary claim, dangerous as it is false, often an attempt to foment conflict and to disseminate Anglophobia. And I don't start from the presumption that because someone's English, he or she is good, or that because someone's Irish, he or she is good. So it's a key plank of Irish republicanism. So what is Irish republicanism? I better define my terms. That's the belief that the whole of Ireland ought to be totally separate from Great Britain and a republic, not a monarchy. So Republicans are hardline nationalists. Many people in Ireland are moderate nationalists, so they want Ireland, or most of it, to be independent or mostly independent, might contemplate some political link to Great Britain. The irony is, of course, Irish nationalists of all stripes are Europhiles, and therefore, via the European Union, we were somewhat united with Great Britain, as well as a great many other countries. Let's go back to basics. 1171, Ireland were divided into several different kingdoms, often at war against each other. We did have a high king in Tara. We had some notion of common laws, a Brehon law. There was no royal dynasty. It was fought over, the high kingship, every time a king died. Some families had captured it and held it for several generations. Fascinatingly, this high kingship continued for quite some time, decades at least, after the King of England also became Lord of Ireland. So in the 20th century, the main complaint, I suppose, of nationalists was that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, but no one could dispute that a clear majority of people in Northern Ireland wished to remain part of the United Kingdom. And this is perhaps the core irony of nationalism, saying that Ireland has the right to secede from the United Kingdom, whereas Northern Ireland does not have the right to secede from Ireland. Why? Ireland is a nation, it's said. And this is also a fascinating historiographical debate. Is Ireland one nation or two? There's no universally agreed definition of what a nation is. So nations are not sacred and they're not eternal. Their boundaries are not fixed in time or in space. Every nation must have come into existence at some point. It may have come into existence quite suddenly or very gradually. On Sinn Féin's website, they made the bogus statement that Ireland has always been a nation. Now, no nation has always existed. Nations are man-made, and nations are not drawn by God's right hand, as one Republican ballad claimed. It's up to us to make or to unmake nations. So the boundaries of nations are blurred, both in time and geographically. One of the scintillating and often overlooked historical facts is when Northern Ireland was twice offered to the Irish government publicly in the Second World War by Churchill, the Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, he both times refused to even discuss it. So Winston Churchill sent the message, a nation once again, now or never. If the south of Ireland would join the Allied side, Northern Ireland would be handed over to Southern Ireland. There'd be a united 32-county state. And de Valera, he called himself a Republican, and he refused to even talk about it. So the selective amnesia and the hypocrisy is quite extraordinary. Obviously Ireland until 1921, for over a century, had been a full part of the United Kingdom, along with our kith and kin in Wales, Scotland and England, where virtually all of us had relatives, And almost everyone in Ireland has ancestors from Wales, Scotland, and England. So that's another nationalist fallacy, the idea that we're particularly different from our brethren in Great Britain. So the United Kingdom in 1921, the time of the partition of Ireland, was one of the freest countries in the world, where virtually all men over the age of 21 were permitted to vote, exceptions for peers of the realm, the mentally ill, people in prison, and women over the age of 30 were allowed to vote. You must remember just how unusual that was a century ago. In a few European countries or North America, most adults were allowed to vote. In Latin America, almost nobody. In African countries and Asian countries, very, very few people were allowed to vote. There wasn't even a sham of democracy in most of these countries. So we're exceptionally fortunate to have such a wide degree of free expression at the time. So people are allowed to say what they want, to say that they would like Ireland to leave the United Kingdom and become a 32-county republic. So prior to 1801, of course, we'd shared a king with England and Wales. His title was the King of Ireland as well as the King of Great Britain. Confusingly, it was King of England prior to 1707 as well as King of Scotland. I won't get into it how Scotland and England united. So people in the United Kingdom or in the Kingdom of Ireland, when we were a separate realm, people were allowed to do what they want, to go what they want, to largely say what they want. There were some restrictions on freedom of expression. People were not allowed to blaspheme, although fascinatingly that law against offending Christianity obviously existed in Ireland in some form right up until 1971, when the Irish Constitution dropped that article about the special status of the Catholic Church. People were allowed to emigrate. Ultimately, people were allowed to vote with their feet. And you can't assume that was the case everywhere. There are many Eastern European countries in the 20th century where people were not allowed to leave. They had to seek permission to leave, and it was very, very difficult to get to leave. And those who asked to leave would often be discriminated against, even imprisoned for doing so. So the UK, as I was saying, in the early 20th century was a democracy, and very few countries could make that boast at the time. 1921, there were no religiously discriminatory laws. People of any religious denomination could be promoted to high office. Now, if you go along before that, 1829, and that's when Catholic emancipation came, the Catholic majority in Ireland, we were legally discriminated against at that time. Does that amount to oppression? Some people would argue that it does. The Act of Union had been passed in 1800, kicked in on New Year's Day, 1801, and the idea was that anti-Catholic legislation would be repealed immediately, but that didn't happen, which Pitt the Younger had wanted. George III spoke against it. The king, he didn't have a veto on these things, but he had extensive powers of patronage and was able to get some of the anti-Catholics in Parliament to make sure that wasn't passed for that time. Now, one point that's often overlooked is that in 18th century Ireland, the legislation that discriminated against the Catholic majority, that was passed by our own Parliament. The main statute was the 1704 Act to prevent the further growth of popery. By growth, perhaps they ought to have said regeneration. And these were laws drawn up, drafted, passed in Dublin, entirely by Irishmen. Now, so our Parliament was exclusively Protestant at the time. Now, we're looking back to the 18th century, was a pre-democratic era. So if we're going to complain Ireland wasn't a democracy, yes, that's true, because nobody in the world was. Even if we'd had no political connection whatsoever with our neighbour, it's very, very likely we would have been dominated by our baronial class, as we were in the 18th century. Now, as it happened, our baronial class in the 18th century was almost entirely Protestant. So the right to vote and the right to be elected was only those with extensive real property. So people often try and pin this on some connection to Great Britain when we had a separate parliament. If we look back to the 12th century, before we had a political connection to our neighbour, were we not dominated by our own baronial class back then? Yes, of course we were. We'd had feudalism, we'd had slavery before that time. One of the things that nationalists never like to point out is that slavery in Ireland was abolished when it became connected to England. Another thing that has undergone erasure is the fact that we're only fully united when we were connected to Great Britain. As I pointed out, we were several different kingdoms. There was near constant warfare in Ireland in the 12th century. We're a deeply divided country, and we had a large Danish minority on the east coast. And I don't stint in talking about how there were unfair laws in Ireland when we were connected to Great Britain. These were passed by Irish people, and yes, they were backed up by many people in Great Britain. That's enough for this video.